Yeah. Well, hey, happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. Hopefully nobody figured out it was Mother's Day when you got here today. You already knew, right? I knew a long time ago, just so you know, I knew. I actually write up my Mother's Day card and put it in the mail a week ago. How good a son am I? My wife told me I needed to do it, but still, I still think it counts, right? And honestly, I think I would have known it was Mother's Day even if I had no idea because of the planning process. I think I would have gotten here because just walking around, you can kind of tell it's Mother's Day. Have you noticed that? On Mother's Day, here's what I've noticed. On Mother's Day, there's an uptick in VPKs, very photogenic kids. Have you noticed that? Like Mother's Day, there's just a few more of them. Like there's a few more cute dresses, a few more bows in the hair, a few more little boys with bow ties on. Right, just Mother's Day. It's a little more dressy and a little less messy. Anybody else notice that? Which is ironic because motherhood is messy, and so on the day that we celebrate moms, we try to minimize the mess, right? And I don't know we should do that because motherhood is messy. Can I get an amen or maybe just a weary groan from everybody who knows that motherhood is a little bit messy? Yeah, and actually, how about this? Can we give a little love to all the moms who have loved us in spite of the mess? And whose love got us through the mess? Absolutely. We love our moms here at Mission Hills. But motherhood's messy. I figured this out years ago. I was in a season where I was traveling a lot, and I wasn't home all that often, and I happened to be home on a Saturday, and so I told my wife, hey, why don't you go off and do something fun? I'll take care of the kids, right? I was going to be a good husband, so she went off, and quite honestly, the first hour I was like, man, this is just a breeze. This is not that big a deal. My kids were like, I think Rochelle was 5, Lene was about 2, and they were kind of occupying each other, and it didn't take that much. I was like, well, I don't know that she really needed a break. This is really not that hard. And then from somewhere in the house, I heard my daughter Rochelle, the oldest one, going, Lene, stop it. Lene, stop. And I was like, okay, I probably need to get involved. So I went in, and in the kitchen, the kitchen floor was covered in Doritos, and Lene was dancing on them. And here's what I think happened. I think probably a Dorito fell, and Rochelle, who is the very responsible child, she was like, hey, don't step on that because it'll make a mess. And Lene, who takes that kind of thing as a challenge, was like, and then Rochelle's like, no, you can't do that. You're making a mess. And then Lene was like, which is when I walked in, right? And she had on the little footy pajamas. You remember those? But her footy pajamas were covered in Dorito dust up to about her ankles. And Rochelle's like, ah. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so I start cleaning all this up, and I'm in the midst of all this. And I looked at Rochelle and I was like, is this the kind of thing your mom has to deal with every day? And she goes, pretty much. I was like, oh, okay. She probably did need a break. Motherhood is messy, right? But I got good news today. There is meaning in the mess. And that's what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about finding the meaning in the mess and what it takes to find it. Why don't you go grab a Bible? We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 1 today. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, really an incredible story for Mother's Day. And actually, God laid this in my heart several months ago, and I'm excited to share with you what he gave to me. 1 Samuel 1 says this: there was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jehoam, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. You don't need to know any of that. And everybody went, whew, right? Here's where you need to pay attention. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Now, Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. And I know that seems like a weird place to start a Mother's Day message, right, with a woman who didn't have kids, but I actually think it's really an important place to start a Mother's Day message, because I think we all know that the practice of being a mom is messy, but I think sometimes we forget, for some women, the process of becoming a mom is actually pretty messy. And there's a lot of women, maybe you're joining us today, that they're struggling with fertility, or you have struggled with it, or you have someone in your life who has struggled trying to get pregnant, even though that's what they want maybe more than anything else, but it just doesn't seem to be what's happening, right? And that can be a really painful thing. Some women, it's really easy, right? Peninnah, it seems pretty easy, right? I mean, they're just some women that honestly, it's almost like their husbands look at them and go, you're looking pretty good, girl. And they're like, welp, I'm pregnant again, right? It's just easy. Other women, it doesn't seem to be so easy. And I feel like that's happening more and more today. I've been in vocational ministry 30 years, and I feel like in the last 10 years, I walked with more couples struggling with infertility than I did the previous 20. It just seems like that is a bigger issue now than it has ever been. And that can be a really painful thing. And maybe that's you. Maybe you're in that. I just want to say I'm really proud of you for coming to church on Mother's Day. I'm proud of you for joining us at one of our campuses or joining us online or even listening to the podcast afterwards, because I know how painful the reminder of that struggle can be. But I'm proud of your faith for joining us today. Because it's one thing to pursue God when he's providing what you want. It's faith when you are pursuing God even when he isn't providing exactly what you want. And I know how waiting for that provision can be painful. I think part of the reason it's painful is because when you're struggling to have a kid, when you want a kid, it's not just a fertility problem, it's an identity problem. It's like, who am I and where do I fit in? I actually think Hannah knew something about that. It's interesting. We're told here that Elkanah, this guy, he had two wives. One was called Hannah, the other Peninnah. Now, Hannah's mentioned first. The one who didn't have kids is mentioned first, which suggests that that was probably his first wife. Hannah was probably the first wife. And the only reason he had a second wife was because his first wife was having a hard time having kids. And so if you can kind of imagine Hannah going, hey, not only can I not have kids, but like, I don't even know where I fit in this family, right? Like, I feel like I'm being pushed out. I feel like I don't belong. And so it's not just a fertility crisis, it's an identity crisis. And one of the things I've found over the years is that a lot of moms, either whether they want to be moms or they are moms or kind of on the back end of that and their kids are headed off and they're not sure what it means to be a mom when their kids are. I found that motherhood often creates a crisis of identity. A lot of moms go through a crisis of identity. And you know, Hannah, and maybe you are in that place where like, I don't know where I fit in when I can't have kids. But honestly, maybe you've had kids and you're kind of, you're knee deep in diapers and midnight feedings and you're kind of going, is this my life now? Right? I remember Cleta going through it. Cleta is an amazing leader. She's a builder of things. And we had two little girls and I remember her kind of going like, is this just my life now? Is this what I am? And yeah, there's a joy in it, but there's also this sense of, but who am I now, right? It's an identity crisis. I think it happens for women when their kids are leaving and they've been a mom and that's kind of been the focus of their lives for so long, and now the kids are headed off and they're kind of going, wait, who am I if I'm not Emily's mom? Who am I when I'm not driving Joey to soccer practice? Like, where am I? See, motherhood often creates a crisis of identity. It certainly did for Hannah, and maybe it has for you, but there's some good news in that, and that is there's an opportunity in that crisis of identity. There's an opportunity to figure out, who are you outside of the circumstances that surround you, okay? That's what we all need to do, honestly. It's not just moms. All of us need to figure out who am I regardless of the circumstances around me. And it's when we do that we start actually being able to find the meaning in the mess. Because here's the thing, finding meaning in the mess starts with knowing who you are in the mess. Not who you are because of the mess, but who you are in the mess, who you are regardless of the mess or the circumstances around you. And I remember Cleta kind of wrestling through that, and she said something at one point that I just thought that's absolutely brilliant. I want to share it with you today. She kind of figured out as she was going through that identity crisis that she had to remind herself, and maybe you need to remind yourself of this, I'm a child of my father before I'm a mother of my child. That's what she said. I'm a child of my father before I'm a mother of my child. In other words, her identity in Christ, her identity in her relationship with God was the foundation of who she is. And that actually allows her not only to kind of, stay strong in the midst of all kinds of stuff around her, but also it allows her to see meaning in all the stuff around her, all the meaning in the mess around her. And maybe that's just something that you need to remind yourself of, to say, I'm a child of my father before I'm and you can fill in the blank. It's Mother's Day, so we'll say before I'm a mother of my child, but honestly, maybe before I'm a father, before I'm an engineer, before I'm a teacher, before I'm a coach, before I'm a husband, before any of those things, you have a relationship with God, or at least I hope you do. Because that's where we find identity, and it's in that identity that we are able to look at the mess and find some of the meaning. I think Hannah understood that, and part of the reason I say that is because she kept worshiping God. She kept coming to God and pursuing him, even though she was still wondering why he hadn't given what she wanted, but she kept worshiping. It says, year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Now, whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. Pay attention to that. She had a lot of them. She had a litter, basically. All right? She had a lot of kids. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her. And the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. And her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? And I know it's Mother's Day, but can I just talk to the men for a second? Guys, if your wife comes to you and she is struggling because she is longing for something God has not released into her life, and your strategy is to say, babe, look at me. Look at me and think how lucky you are to have me in your life. If that is your strategy, you do not have a strategy. You have stupid. And stupid is not a strategy. Okay, what should his strategy have been? Here's what I think he should have said. Here's what the strategy should have been. He should have said to her, hey, honey, let me remind you something. Sometimes the door is closed because what's behind the door is still under construction. Sometimes the door is closed and you're knocking on, you're like, God, why won't you open the door? And the answer is because he's like, I'm building something here, you just got to hang on. And it's good. It's better than what you thought, okay? It's so good, I can't microwave it, okay? It's so good, I can't put it in the air pot, right? I can't air fry this thing up. No, it's got to slow cook, okay? Sometimes the door's closed because what's behind the door is still under construction. So interesting. It says twice in this passage I just read, it says that the Lord had closed her womb. I'm going to say two things about that. First, I want to say that just because the Lord had closed her womb, it says that God was active in some of that. He wasn't letting her have kids yet. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what's happening to you, okay? Maybe you're struggling to have kids, and it doesn't necessarily mean that God is keeping it from happening, okay? The Bible has description and prescription. Sometimes the Bible describes things that are happening, and sometimes it prescribes what we're supposed to do or how we're supposed to think about it. But the reality is, this is a description of what God did with Hannah, but it's not necessarily a description of what he's doing with you, and it's certainly not a prescription of how to think about it. Sometimes God does this. Sometimes the reality is, because we live in a sinful, fallen world, things just don't work. Our parts aren't quite with the program, you know what I'm saying? Sometimes that happens. So don't assume God's doing this to you, but also understand that it's interesting. Why would God do this? If God was good, why would he close her womb? And here's what's fascinating to me. Her rival, Peninnah, had lots of sons, and all her sons and daughters. That's what he says, right? She had a litter, okay? How many of their names do you know? Some of you are brand new to church, and you're like, I didn't know there was going to be a quiz. I don't know. I haven't read the Bible. I don't have any idea. That's okay, because actually, even if you've read the whole Bible, even if you read it multiple times, you probably don't know the names of any of her kids because they're never named. She had lots of kids, but they're completely unknown. Hannah, on the other hand, spoiler alert, she's going to have a son. But we're going to know his name. His name's Samuel. It's actually the name of the book because he's the one who wrote the book. In some ways, this first part of the book is actually, it's a tribute to his mom, right? Samuel was kind of a big deal in the ancient Jewish world. He was a great prophet. He was a bridge. There was a season when the Israelites were led by judges, and then there was a season when they were led by kings, and Samuel was kind of the judge who moved things into the kings. He was the prophet that God spoke to and had him identify a young man who honestly on the surface didn't look like all that much, but God said, yeah, he's going to be the king that this nation needs. And so Samuel was the one who anointed David, David and Goliath, right? Samuel's the one who got to identify him before anybody else could ever have recognized that in him. Samuel was kind of a big deal. See, what God was constructing behind the door that was closed was so good. And maybe if Elkanah had said that would have been a good strategy. But let me tell you something too. I don't want to be misunderstood on this. So let me say this. Sometimes we also have to recognize that what God's constructing may not be what we're craving. It's not always what we're craving. I don't want to say to you that just because there is a closed door in your life that on the other side of the door is exactly what you want and God's just making a better version of it. That might be true. I'm surprised at how often it has been true in my life, but sometimes what's behind the door, sometimes what God's constructing isn't actually what I was craving. It's always good though, okay? It's kind of like in Castle Rock. Castle Rock's I live in Castle Rock, and we're going through a kind of a construction boom right now. Every time I turn around, there's a new building going up, and every time we see a new building going up, a commercial building, Claude and I played this little game like, what do you think it's gonna be? And we're not just like guessing, we're actually hoping, because we have a list of things we'd love to see, right? High on my list is P.F. Chang's. I just love me some P.F. Chang's. I would love a P.F. Chang's. There was a new building that was going up recently. We saw it, and I was like, ooh, it's in a location. It looks like a restaurant. It's got big open windows, but they're not like, car bays kind of a thing. So I don't think it's a car thing. I think it's a restaurant. I'm like, come on, P.F. Chang's. And then as they got a little farther along, it started having a little architectural elements. I'm like, I don't know. They're little like these arches, and I'm like, that doesn't seem like a P.F. Chang's. And then it kind of turned into a hacienda kind of look, and I was like, it's a Mexican place. Now, I like Mexican food, but that's just not what I was craving, right? And then they put up the name, it was Los Dos Patrios. Yeah, some of y'all love that, right? Like, I'm just not that big a fan. It's okay, but it's not a P.F. Chang's, right? That's not what I was craving. But I went there the other day. I'd kind of decided I wasn't going to go there, but I was with Danny Ortley. We were doing some writing together, and so he goes, hey, let's go to lunch. Let's go to Los Dos. I was like, okay, I know he loves it. We'll go. And I was looking at the menu, and they had a new item on the menu. It was barbacoa taco. Now, I love me some barbacoa. So I was like, let me try that. And let me tell you something. One bite in, I was glad there was a Los Dos Patrios in Castle Rock. It's not what I was craving, but now I'm really glad that that's what came. You understand what I'm saying? I don't want anybody to walk away going, oh, pastor said that if the door is closed, it's because God's constructing a better version behind the door. I'm not necessarily saying that. Sometimes what God's constructing isn't what we're craving, but I promise you that whatever he's constructing, you're going to be really glad you have it. You just may not know it yet, okay? Now once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house, and in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. And I realized that, that seems like a weird thing for somebody to say when he's like, God, give me a baby, and I'll never put a razor on his head. Like, who shaves a baby's head, right? But she's not just talking about as a baby. She's his whole life. He'll no razor. And what she's talking about is something in ancient Israel called a Nazirite vow. And a Nazirite vow was where somebody was specially set apart for service to the Lord. That God had particular plans for them, and they were setting themselves apart to be used by God in a powerful way. And the way they showed everybody else that they had been set apart was they didn't shave and they didn't cut their hair, okay? Most famous Nazirite, by the way, a guy named Samson. Okay, some of you may know that story. So that's what she's saying. She's like, he's going to be set apart. And what I love about this, if you think about it, is what's happening is she was ready to surrender what she hadn't even received. You see that? She was ready to surrender to God, to put in God's hands a child that hadn't even been put in hers yet. And I love that because I actually think that's a really powerful thing. It's not a powerful thing for getting God to give you what you want, okay? God's not a vending machine. It's not like, well, no, if you put the right amount of money in the offering plate and then you press the right buttons and you say the right prayers, then God will automatically give you what you want. That's not it, okay? This is a powerful formula, not for getting a response, okay? This isn't a formula for getting a response. This is a formula for getting ready. It's a formula for getting ready regardless of what the response is. Because when you are willing to give over to God what you're asking for from God, you're actually preparing yourself. And if God says yes and he gives you that blessing, then you're prepared to do with that blessing what God always gives blessings to do, which is to be a blessing. God gives blessings so we can be a blessing. And if you're being prepared in your heart to give things over to the Lord, then whatever blessing you're asking for, you're ready to use it in the way God wants us to use blessings. It's also getting you ready if God says, wait, not now. Because you're like, okay, but I'm preparing myself, and I was going to give it into your hands anyway, so I trust you. And sometimes God says no, or he says, I got something else, but this is a formula. When you're ready to surrender what you haven't even received, that's actually getting yourself ready for when God says no, because you go, oh, okay, I trust you. I don't understand that I'm a little disappointed, but I trust that you're good, and what you have is going to be good in a way that I just haven't anticipated yet. So what she does here is actually really powerful. It's getting her ready, and it's very often, I think, that we have to get ready before we can receive what it is that God has for us, okay? So she says, yeah, I'm ready to surrender what I haven't even received. Now, as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli, the priest, observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. And Eli thought she was drunk. A priest who can't recognize prayer, that's interesting. And he said to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Well, not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I've been pouring out my heart to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. And Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. And she said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. And then, watch this, then she went her way, and she ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Her demeanor changed, her heart changed. She went from misery to at least peace. And then the question we want to ask is why? What happened here? And I think it's tempting, and I've heard people say, well, I think it's because, the priest said, oh, may God give you, the priest promised basically that God was going to give her what she was asking for. But is that what he said? He didn't promise that she would get what she was asking for. And besides that, even if he was giving her a prophecy, would you listen to a prophecy from a priest who can't recognize prayer? Eli's kind of a mess, actually. If you continue reading the book, you're going to see the rest of that. Okay, that's kind of setting the rest of that up. But I don't think she left feeling better because, the priest said I was going to get what I wanted. Here's what I think happened. I think she realized in this little exchange that she was being known, she was coming across to everybody as a miserable woman. Her misery was what she was known by. She was allowing that. I think she realized that's all he saw in me. She realized that that's kind of become my identity. And her longing really was becoming core to her. And I think at this moment she realized that that's not the way it's supposed to be. I can't be identified by my longing. I can't be identified by what I lack. I need to change a heart here. And hopefully God gives me what I want, but even if he doesn't, I gotta turn this around, right? And maybe she went off and she started going, hey, God hasn't given me this, but he has given me other things. He's given me a husband who loves me. Dude's dumb as a rock, but he does care about me. He's taking care of me. He's a little full of himself, but he's generous and he's kind. So maybe she started to focus on what she had and not just on what she had. I don't know exactly all the details, but what I see here happening is something that I see happen. I've seen it in my life. I've seen it in my family's life. I've seen it in the lives of many people I've walked with. See, what happens is that God often changes our hearts before he changes our circumstances. We want him to change our circumstance. We think if he changes my circumstances, then my heart will just follow along. And God goes, no, I need you to be a little more solid than that. I need you to have an identity that doesn't rest in your circumstances. I need to see a change in your heart before I change your circumstances. And so he leads us to change in our hearts before he changes circumstances. And maybe you've experienced some of that. I've seen it in my own life. I several years ago, I saw it in the life of my daughter, Lene. Some of you know this, but there was a period when Lene was like 14 to 16 where she was suffering from chronic abdominal pain. I mean, really bad. Lene's a tough kid, and honestly, I think what she was dealing with probably would have kept me unconscious for 2 years. It kept her on the couch for 2 years. She could just barely get to school and come back, and it was just really rough. And we went to all the doctors. We tried all of the things, and every time they just kind of went like, yeah, I don't really know. Maybe she just needs to take opioids. Yeah, we're not ready to go down that road. It was just rough. And Lene was wrestling. She was asking God for healing, and she wasn't getting it. And every time that she asked her for healing, and then she saw another doctor, and the doctor had nothing to offer her, That was the disappointment. But she wrestled with God for a while, and then one night she came to this moment where she finally said to God, you know what, if you don't heal me, it's okay. I'm going to serve you, I'm going to follow you, I'm going to trust you, even if you don't heal me. That was a pivotal moment for her. It was a change in her heart. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it was literally the next day that a doctor called us and said, I think we know what the problem is, and I think here's what you need to do. And that actually led to her healing. Coincidence that happened the day after when they went, God, I love you and I'm going to trust you even if you don't do this for me? I don't think so. God often changes our hearts before he changes our circumstances. And you may be praying to God right now, begging him to change the circumstance, and maybe what you need to be doing is praying and begging him to change your heart. Now, early the next morning, they rose, and they worshiped before the Lord. She went back to worshiping. And then they went back to their home at Ramah. And Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. And so in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, which in Hebrew means something like he hears, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. Now when her husband Elkanah went up with all of his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord, so the next year, to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, after the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. Feels a little odd on the surface, right? I mean, she made this promise. She was going to surrender him to God. She's going to give him over to God. And then the first chance she has to do it, she's like, yeah, I'm going to stay home. Sounds like a negative thing, but I don't think it is, because she actually says, yeah, I mean, once he's weaned, this is exactly what I'm going to do. That's exactly what the plan is. I'm going to follow through with the vow, right? I think what she's doing, though, is very powerful. What she's doing basically is going, I only have a few moments with him. And I'm going to make the most of them, right? I want this time with my son. Get a little peace and quiet, right? Any moms need a little peace and quiet every now and then? Like, yeah, Elkanah's going to leave along with Peninnah, who's kind of a witch, right? She's a really unpleasant person. I don't want to spend any time with her. I don't need to go. And, she's been mocking me because I didn't have a kid. Well, now I finally have a kid. And now she's like, yeah, that you only got one? That's kind of sad. Besides that, look at that thing. Where'd you get that nose? That's an ugly baby. How'd you have an ugly baby? My babies look so much better than your baby. I don't want to be. So what she did was she stayed home and she made the most of what she was only going to have for a moment. And I know this is a little cliche, but I think sometimes things are cliche because they're true, and sometimes we just need to be reminded of them. Listen, if you want to find the meaning in the mess, here's one of the things you need to do. You need to make the most of what you're only going to have for a moment. Make the most of what you're only going to have for a moment. That phase where they're kind of useless. Like, if you lay them down, you can come back a while later, they're still there. And it's mostly diapers and midnight feedings. There's something powerful in that moment. I remember holding my kids at that age going, this is the most useless thing I have ever had. And yet I am absolutely, utterly in love with her. And for the first time, I kind of understood what God must be thinking about. And that my relationship with God isn't based on my performance, because nothing I can possibly do is going to impress him. He doesn't need any of it. And yet he loves me enough to send his son to die for me. This is the first time I really started to understand that a little bit. But that moment only lasted for a little while. Then they were toddlers. And then there was the terrible twos. But there was meaning in that. They're starting to investigate the world, and they're discovering things, and that was really fun, right? It was a lot of work, but it was kind of fun. There was meaning in that, as messy as it was. And then the terrible twos, then the terrible teens, which are kind of like the terrible twos on steroids. Because again, they're figuring out the world, and they're becoming the people that God's created them to be. And I was starting to see in my daughters glimpses of the women they were going to become, and I was like, this is kind of cool. And yeah, there's always that going, hey, the next phase, right? When there's no more eye rolling. That's going to be so great. But there was something in that moment, as messy as it was, that we needed to make the most of. And then there's the crazy college years, then there are the angsty young adult years, right? I mean, but if you want to find the meaning in the mess, what you got to start doing is you got to start making the most of what you're only going to have for a moment. And I know it's cliche, but it's true. And by the way, just practically, can I tell you this? Making the most of what you're only going to have for a moment is not the same thing as trying to make every moment the most. Stop trying to make every moment perfect. Stop trying to make it something that it wasn't, right? Stop choking the life out of it. Like, listen, I love my wife. My wife's so amazing. She has this one little habit, and that is when we're having a moment as a family, she's like, we got to get a picture. And it's not just any picture, right? If it was just like, hey, there's a bunch of husbands going, honey. It's not just any picture. It had to be the perfect picture, right? It's like, oh, wait, let's capture a moment. Okay, no, you need to move over. Okay, Lene, step around back there. Craig, your head's shiny. Could you move your head? Okay, you get that angle right there. And I'm going to try to get right here. Okay. And the thing is, like, sometimes what happens is the moment's, it's dead, right? You tried to capture the moment. What you did was you killed the moment. It doesn't need to go on Instagram. It doesn't need to be perfect. And I mean that in a sense that's more than just the snapshots that we get on our phones, right? I just mean, look, make the most of the moment, but that often means just being in it, not trying to turn it into something it's not. Sometimes the most meaningful moments are a mess that you don't even need to worry about cleaning up. I go back to my daughter dancing on Doritos. There was something really powerful in that, actually. I look back on it now, and I'm like, actually, I saw something in Rochelle that I would see her grow into be. This is a woman with a really high level of responsibility. Like, I need to make this right, and she'll step in and she'll do what needs to be done. And I've seen her do that in some situations she was too young for, but she was the only one God had in that place who was able to step in and make something powerful out of it. I saw that even back then. And Lene, dancing on her Doritos, I saw a little bit of the fierceness in her that I had come to see in her as an adult. I mean, if I could go back, I would have grabbed her hands and we would have done a dance together. And I would have cleaned up the mess later. At the time, I missed it because I was mad at the mess. And I missed the meaning. Do what seems best to you, her husband, Elkanah told her. Stay here until you've weaned him, only may the Lord make good his word. And so the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. And after he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And when the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli. And she said to him, "Pardon me, my Lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. And so now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. And I think for a lot of us, what she did there is kind of inconceivable, right? And it kind of feels like, well, she gave up her child. How is that? How could any mother do that? How could you give up your child? And what I want you to notice is she didn't give Samuel up. What does it say? It says he will be given over to the Lord. And it may seem subtle, but it's actually really significant. There's actually a world of difference between giving up and giving over. Giving up says, I can't. Giving over says, I can't, but you can. Giving up means bowing out. Giving over is actually a very active process. It's a constant willingness to surrender to God what has come from him and what only he can make into what it was intended to be. Here's the differences. I've kind of figured it out over the years. Listen, those who have given up, they have bent shoulders. Those who have given over have bent knees because they're in constant prayer. It's not that they've bowed out. It's not that they've given up. It's that they put into God's hands what came from his hands and what can only become what it was intended to be in his. And if you want to find the meaning in the mess, that's what you got to learn how to do. Not how to give up, but how to give over. How do we do that? What does it take to give over your children to God? Let me give you 4 practical things. Number 1, you got to keep remembering that God is good. That you're putting your child in the hands of someone who loves your child more than you do, if that's even conceivable. It requires remembering that God is good. Second, it requires trusting God to know what is good. Because sometimes we don't. I mean, quite honestly, if I had had the ability, I would have kept Lene from going through the pain. And yet that pain made her fierce and compassionate. It's a weird combination, and it's a beautiful thing to see. I didn't know how good it was going to be. Like my daughter, Rochelle, I mean, she dated some guys that Cled and I were like, that is not the guy. And she went through some pain that I would have spared her from if I could possibly have. I would have taken it myself. And yet, what she went through turned her into a brilliant, competent, strong, independent woman who is now married to this incredible guy named Josiah. And she hadn't gone through what she had to go through some goobers to get to some gold, basically, is what I'm saying. I'd have kept the goobers out of her life, but I'm really glad for the gold. But she became ready for him, and he became ready for her and some other stuff that I know his parents would have spared him from. But we have to keep trusting God to know what is truly good. And the third thing we got to do is we got to keep practicing surrender, because surrender is an active process. Remember, it's not bent shoulders, it's bent knees, right? It's an ongoing process of prayer and constantly trusting God, because we have to keep doing it. And we got to start small. And so many times parents struggle to do this because they hover over their kids and they're so protective early on that they're not practicing surrender so that they're ready for it when it comes later in life. Man, so much I would have spared my kids from, but I would have been keeping them from something so powerful. So we practiced, and when we sent our kids off to college, when Rochelle went off to college, she went to Colorado, UNC, University of Northern Colorado. Not a Christian school, just in case you're wondering. And somebody said to me, like, you're a pastor, why would you send your kid to a non-Christian school? And I was like, well, it just seemed like the right thing to do. And he said to me, he goes, how do you have the courage to throw your kids to the wolves? And I didn't have an answer then. I've been thinking about it for 4 years, though, and a couple weeks ago somebody said to me, because my youngest daughter, Lene, she's at CU Boulder, which is way worse than UNC. And somebody said exactly the same thing to me again. They said, how do you have the courage to throw your kids to the wolves? And I've been thinking about it for 4 years, so I said, we didn't throw our kids to the wolves. We threw our warriors at the wolves. Yeah. But it took a lot of surrender. We had to let them date some people we didn't think they should date. We had to let them try some things we didn't think they were ready for. We had to let them fail at some things and make mistakes and take some consequences from those mistakes. I had a neighbor a few years ago that her kid, she's so protective, he wasn't allowed to play in the backyard. It had a 6-foot fence around the backyard, okay? She wouldn't let him play in the backyard by himself. I don't know what she was worried about, hawks, I assume. She wouldn't even let him play in the front yard if she was in the front yard. She's like, well, he might run to the street and I wouldn't be fast enough to get there, even though it wasn't a busy street. And I was like, that kid is gonna get eaten by Pomeranians. Forget wolves. We gotta practice surrender, and it starts small before we have to send them off to a college dorm or off down an aisle to get married to somebody that we just barely know, right? We gotta be practicing surrender all along. And the last thing we need to do is we've got to be praying like Jesus. I think of Jesus in the garden going, hey God, Dad, I don't really want to go to the cross, but if that's what needs to happen, I'm gonna trust you, right? And there's 3 things in there I think are so powerful. Basically what Jesus said was, God, I know you can. I ask you would, here's my request, but then he says, but I trust you will. I trust your will. but I trust you will do what is right and is good. And we got to learn how to pray that for our kids. God, I know you can. God, I ask you would, and be open with it, be honest about it. But it's got to come back to, but God, I trust you will, because I trust you. And then it's only in the hands of the one who's given us our kids that they can become all of the incredible things that we know he designed them for. Hey God, we're grateful for our moms. And we know that motherhood is messy. So much of life is messy. But you promise us there is always meaning in that mess if we'll just have eyes to see it. And we thank you for your servant Hannah and the lessons that she teaches us about what it looks like to find meaning in the mess. God, give us the strength and the courage to trust you. And thank you for letting us be part of this amazing thing that we call parenthood. We're never going to really be worthy, but would you make us better? In Jesus' name, amen.